March 1945. Germany was dying, but it refused to surrender. The men of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division had pushed beyond the Rhine, their tanks and trucks grinding through shattered towns where church bells no longer rang. The cold air reeked of smoke and diesel, and every horizon shimmered with fire. Private Jack Ellis pressed his body against the cracked wall of a farmhouse near Paderborn, gripping his M1 Garand so tightly the metal bit into his palms. Around him, his squad waited in silence, breath fogging in the frigid air. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a German Panzerfaust waited. "Eyes up," Sergeant Davis whispered, voice hoarse from sleepless nights. The words barely carried over the low hum of artillery in the distance. Suddenly, a flash erupted from the tree line, a missile streaked across the field and struck a Sherman tank dead center. The explosion was blinding, throwing a wave of heat and dirt into the men's faces. The tank burned like a furnace, its crew's scream swallowed by the roar. The radio crackled to life, static cutting through the haze. "We're surrounded, repeat, surrounded." Ellis could hear it, clear as a whisper in his skull. Around him, the others stared into the smoke, faces pale, eyes reflecting the flames. They weren't fighting for territory anymore, or even victory, only to stay alive. He blinked, wiping grime from his cheek, and saw the faint silhouette of another village up ahead. He muttered to himself, "Just one more town." The words came out flat, mechanical, the way soldiers speak when their hearts are long gone from the war. Ahead lay the heart of Germany, and behind them, the ghosts that would follow them home. By the beginning of 1945, the Allies had crossed into the Third Reich. France was free, Belgium was secure, and the German war machine was bleeding out, but not finished. The last chapters of the war were written in fire, as American, British, and Soviet forces closed in from all sides. The German homeland had become a battlefield, its people starving, its cities flattened, and its army a desperate patchwork of veterans, teenagers, and old men still loyal to Hitler's hopeless dream. For the men of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, Germany was supposed to be the final push, the last march before going home. Instead, it became a nightmare of endless resistance. The closer they came to Berlin, the harder the fighting grew. The 3rd Armored Division had been on the move since Normandy, through the hedgerows of France and the frozen hell of the Ardennes. They had seen too much to believe in glory now. In early March, they were ordered to advance toward Paderborn, a key communications hub in western Germany. The mission sounded simple on paper: clear the towns, cut the roads, and crush the remnants of the Wehrmacht. But what they found was not an army in retreat, it was an army fighting with the ferocity of the damned. German units, though shattered, used every scrap of terrain to their advantage. Villages became fortresses. Every basement, every hayloft, every shadow could hide an enemy with a Panzerfaust or Milligram 42. The Americans learned quickly that the war was far from over. As the division rolled deeper into Germany, the landscape transformed into a panorama of ruin. Smoke rose from the horizon where cities once stood. Burnt-out trains lined the tracks. The countryside smelled of ash and mud. Civilians shuffled along the roads with carts and rags tied to sticks, white flags that meant nothing to the jittery young soldiers watching them through their rifle sights. Some GIs gave food or chocolate to children. Others avoided them entirely. The line between soldier and survivor was fading fast. The weather didn't help. The winter of 1944–45 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow melted into ankle-deep sludge that clogged engines and soaked through boots. Men went days without dry socks. The cold made weapons jam and froze the grease inside the tank turrets. But worse than the cold was the silence that followed each battle, the kind that filled the ears when the guns stopped and the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Soldiers walked through ruins where only dogs and the dead remained. Entire towns were leveled. Church steeples lay snapped in half. And yet, from the rubble, the Germans still fought. Cologne was one of the first great tests. The city had been pounded by years of Allied bombing, but pockets of German troops remained, determined to hold what little ground they had left. The 3rd Armored Division entered the city in early March. Street by street, they fought among the debris, tanks grinding over cobblestones slick with rain and ash. The sound of gunfire echoed off the cathedral walls, that Gothic monument that somehow stood untouched amid the sea of destruction. When the battle was over, the city was silent except for the faint hum of distant artillery. The Americans looked around and saw nothing left to conquer, only stones, corpses, and a cathedral that seemed to mock them by still standing. From there, the push toward the Rhine began. The Rhine River had always been more than just water to the Germans, it was a symbol of defense, the last line before the heartland. Every bridge was rigged to explode, every crossing watched by anti-aircraft guns. When word reached the 3rd Armored that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had been captured intact by the 9th Armored Division, disbelief rippled through the ranks. An intact bridge meant a direct path into central Germany, something Hitler had sworn would never happen. American engineers raced across the river under heavy shelling, and though the bridge would eventually collapse from damage, the foothold it created changed the war's momentum completely. The Rhine was breached. Germany was open. As the front advanced, the soldiers noticed a strange shift in the faces they saw. The SS men still fought with fanatic zeal, but most Wehrmacht troops were surrendering in groups now, some without even firing a shot. Yet every surrender could be a trap. GIs learned not to relax. Too many times, they had watched a white flag drop and a rifle barrel reappear. No one wanted to be the last man to die in a war that was already lost. Letters sent home from this period revealed the state of mind among the troops. Many of the men no longer wrote about victory or medals, they wrote about sleep, about food, about simply staying alive. One soldier from Pennsylvania described it best in a letter to his wife: "Germany looks like the end of the world. Every mile we take feels like we're walking through the ashes of civilization. There are no towns left, only places where towns used to be. I don't know what victory even means anymore." Even the officers began to show the strain. Combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, spread through the ranks like disease. Some men simply shut down, staring blankly at the horizon while shells exploded around them. Others broke completely, wandering off into the fields, muttering about home. Chaplains did their best to console them, but faith was wearing thin. The constant grind of death and noise left no room for prayer. Yet, through it all, units held together. The bond between soldiers became the one thing that kept them moving. By late March, the U.S. First Army had reached the outskirts of Paderborn. The area was defended by elements of the German 116th Panzer Division and a hodgepodge of SS troops who refused to give up. The fighting there was brutal and close, often at point-blank range. Houses became bunkers. Tanks fired down alleys barely wide enough for their turrets. Civilians huddled in cellars, praying for the shells to stop. The Americans advanced one building at a time, sometimes taking the same street twice in a single day as counterattacks surged and fell. At night, the sky glowed orange from burning fuel dumps. The ground trembled under the constant rumble of artillery. Men who had survived Normandy, the Bulge, and the Siegfried Line said that Germany itself was different, darker, heavier, like fighting inside a nightmare. Every face, friend or foe, seemed haunted. And yet, in the middle of it all, there were moments of fragile humanity. A German family sharing bread with an American patrol. A soldier helping an old man carry his wounded son from a collapsed barn. For a fleeting second, the war's noise would fade, and everyone would remember that they were human. Then another shell would fall, and the world would vanish again in smoke. The 3rd Armored Division pushed on, exhausted but relentless. They knew the end was coming, they could feel it in the empty skies, in the way German radio broadcasts grew erratic, in the desperate tone of captured officers who still claimed the Führer had a plan. But among the soldiers, the only plan left was survival. The faces in the foxholes were young, but their eyes belonged to old men. Every mile eastward felt heavier, like the ground itself was warning them that peace would not come easily. By the time they reached the approaches to Paderborn, the American advance had cut deep into Germany's industrial heart. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hills as the last defenses broke apart. The men tightened their grips on their weapons, aware that even now, at the edge of victory, the cost could still be unbearable. They had seen too much to trust hope, only the mission. The mission was simple: move forward, no matter what. By early March 1945, the final act of the war in Europe was playing out on German soil. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was in full retreat. But despite the collapse of the WWII, resistance did not fade, it became more desperate, more fanatical. The men of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, like countless others across the front, advanced through shattered towns and burnt-out villages, where every doorway and cellar could hide an ambush. Their mission was simple on paper: push deeper into the heart of Germany and close the noose around Berlin. Yet for the men on the ground, it became a daily battle for survival against both the enemy and the unseen psychological toll of relentless combat. Corporal James D. Weaver of Pennsylvania wrote home that the world around him felt hollowed out of life. The forests they once marched through in confidence were now tombs of silence, littered with the debris of retreating German units. Dead horses lay in the mud, carts overturned, and abandoned rifles scattered across the frost. The closer they got to the German interior, the heavier the atmosphere became. Villagers stared from behind cracked windows, their faces expressionless, defeated, yet still carrying a glint of fear. The Americans sensed that every shadow might conceal a sniper or a fanatic of the Volkssturm, boys barely 16 or old men clutching old Mauser rifles. The 9th Division moved cautiously, house to house, often encountering resistance that appeared and vanished like smoke. In one ruined town near Remagen, Private Albert Red Hanlon remembered how the smell of cordite and chard would mixed with something worse, sweet and sickening. They'd stumbled into a basement where civilians had been hiding, most too terrified to move. "We weren't sure who was more afraid," he recalled later. "Them or us." War had stripped away all clarity. The line between enemy and survivor blurred into one exhausted mass of human desperation. As Germany's infrastructure collapsed, so too did the illusion of order. Entire convoys of refugees jammed the narrow country roads, moving west in the same direction as the Americans. Mothers carried children wrapped in sheets, soldiers without insignia limped along beside them, and sometimes, Wehrmacht stragglers disguised themselves among civilians to escape capture. The GIs were ordered to separate combatants from refugees, a nearly impossible task. Each decision carried moral weight. One wrong judgment could mean letting a saboteur go free, or worse, harming innocents. Many soldiers began to question what victory even looked like. The propaganda posters they'd seen before the invasion showed liberation and justice. But now, amid crumbling farmhouses and bodies frozen in ditches, they saw only exhaustion and ruin. Lieutenant Paul Simmons described it in his journal: "We came to Germany expecting an enemy. We found a graveyard that still fought back." Each village taken was another reminder that even in defeat, the Reich's shadow lingered. Then came the small but haunting moments, the ones that stayed long after the gunfire stopped. A German boy, barely 10, saluting American troops as they passed, an old woman kneeling to offer bread to a wounded GI, the eerie sound of church bells ringing over an empty square. These fragments of humanity broke through the constant noise of war, reminding the men that behind the uniforms and slogans, everyone had been caught in the same storm. By April, as Allied forces fanned out toward the Elbe, they uncovered the full scale of what had been hidden within the Rhine. Near a place called Gardeligen, a patrol stumbled upon a barn reeking of death. Inside were hundreds of burned corpses, prisoners who had been locked inside and set ablaze by retreating SS guards. The soldiers who witnessed it were never the same. "We thought we knew evil," Sergeant McCloskey said in his after-action report. "Then we saw what men can do when they think no one will ever find out." Word of the massacre spread quickly through the ranks, hardening their resolve but also deepening the sorrow that hung over every man who marched past the wreckage. In the following days, U.S. units moved through one ghost town after another, encountering scattered Wehrmacht units still willing to fight, but increasingly surrendering in disbelief. Some Germans clung to the idea that secret weapons would turn the tide, others simply wanted the war to end. For American troops, victory had become less about flags and glory, and more about survival and comprehension, understanding how humanity had descended so deep into destruction. At night, as they bivouacked in abandoned houses, the men spoke quietly about home. Letters from the States felt unreal now. Baseball games, dances, and small-town streets belonged to another lifetime. They were surrounded by ruins, and yet the world still expected them to carry on as heroes. "You try to sleep," Private Hanlon wrote, "but the silence in this country has a way of talking to you." When the guns finally began to fall silent, the GIs realized that the real battle, the one for their memories, was just beginning. The war had carved itself into their minds, leaving them to wrestle with ghosts that no medal could silence. Each town liberated carried both relief and guilt, each German surrender, a question of what it all had cost. The closer they got to the heart of Germany, the further they seemed to drift from who they once were. For historians, the stories that emerged from those final weeks remain among the most revealing of the war, not because of victory parades or grand strategy, but because of the voices left behind. In diaries, letters, and after-action reports, the soldiers spoke not of triumph, but of endurance, confusion, and the unbearable weight of witnessing a nation's collapse. Their words, fragile yet unflinching, preserve the essence of 1945, the year the world stared into the abyss and saw itself reflected. By mid-April 1945, the roads leading into central Germany were choked with the wreckage of two collapsing armies, the retreating Wehrmacht and the relentless American advance. Columns of U.S. tanks and half-tracks rolled through a landscape that looked less like a nation and more like a wound. Burned vehicles lined the ditches, telegraph poles leaned drunkenly against the gray sky, and the smell of oil, ash, and death hung over everything. But even in its death throes, the German war machine lashed out. Scattered pockets of SS fanatics refused to surrender, and every crossroads, every barn, could conceal a trap. For the men of the 9th Infantry Division, the climax of their long and brutal campaign came near the small town of Dessau, on the Elbe River. It was here that the last organized German resistance west of Berlin made its stand. Intelligence had warned of a desperate fight. Radio intercepts hinted that Hitler had ordered every soldier to defend the fatherland to the last bullet. The Americans prepared for one final push, uncertain of what waited beyond the smoke. At dawn on April 20th, ironically, Hitler's birthday, the assault began. Mortars thudded across the river bank, sending fountains of mud and shattered timber into the air. Tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion opened fire on enemy positions, their shells echoing off the crumbling stone buildings. The infantry advanced behind them, weaving through ruined streets under bursts of sniper fire. The Germans fought with the ferocity of men who knew the end was near. Panzerfaust streaked from alleyways, and machine guns barked from church towers. Every corner had to be taken twice. Corporal James Weaver led his squad through the lower town, moving from doorway to doorway. He could hear the cries of civilians trapped in the basements, their pleas drowned by gunfire. At one point, they came across a group of German soldiers barely more than teenagers, Volkssturm boys wearing oversized helmets and mismatched uniforms. They surrendered the moment the GIs rounded the corner, dropping their rifles and raising trembling hands. One of them carried a photograph of his mother pinned inside his coat. Weaver would later write, "I didn't feel victory when they gave up. I felt like I was looking in a mirror." Further north, American engineers tried to secure the bridge across the Elbe, but the Germans had mined it. When a tank attempted to cross, the structure gave way in a thunderous explosion, sending men and steel into the churning water below. The survivors clawed their way to shore, soaked and shaken, while medics scrambled to pull them from the current. "We were so close," one sergeant recalled. "We could see the east bank, but it felt like a world away." Then came the eerie silence that always followed a battle's crescendo. The town of Dessau was burning, smoke rising from every roofline. Civilians emerged cautiously, clutching white sheets, moving like ghosts through the debris. The GIs moved among them, offering water, bandages, and whatever comfort they could spare. They had trained for combat, not for the aftermath. The battlefield was quiet, but the human wreckage spoke louder than any gunfire. It was later that same afternoon when the 9th Division received word, Soviet troops were only days away, advancing from the east. For the first time, the Americans could sense that the end was truly near. The radio chatter shifted from attack plans to occupation orders. There would be no triumphant dash to Berlin, the Elbe would mark their limit. Still, the men couldn't help but look eastward, wondering what the Red Army was seeing on the other side. The climax came not from a single moment of victory, but from a realization, a heavy, collective understanding that the war was ending, yet peace felt foreign. In the quiet streets of Dessau, surrounded by ruins, they stood at the crossroads of history. Sergeant McCloskey later described that day as the strangest kind of triumph, a victory without joy. He had seen his friends buried in foreign soil, had watched enemy soldiers cry for mercy, and had looked upon the wreckage of a world built on lies. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the surviving GIs gathered near the ruins of a church. Someone found a gramophone still intact and played a scratched record of "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." The melody drifted through the smoky air, soft and haunting. Some men smiled. Others wept. The war wasn't officially over, but they all felt it slipping away. In that moment, amid the rubble and the quiet murmur of a broken town, the American soldiers of 1945 understood something profound, that even when the guns stopped, the war inside them would not. The world they had left behind could never return unchanged, and neither could they. The sound of artillery had become their heartbeat, the silence afterward their burden. For many of them, the battle for Dessau was their last fight. A few days later, on April 25, American and Soviet troops met at the town of Torgau on the Elbe, sealing Germany's fate. But it was in places like Dessau, forgotten by headlines, remembered only in letters, that the true turning point had already occurred. It wasn't just the collapse of the Rhine, it was the awakening of the soldiers who had survived it. They had looked into the heart of Germany, and what they saw there changed them forever. The guns along the Elbe fell silent in early May 1945, but silence did not mean peace. The men of the 9th Infantry Division woke each morning to the smell of damp smoke and the hollow echo of a world trying to remember how to breathe again. Germany lay in ruins, its towns gutted, its railways twisted, its people wandering through streets that no longer belonged to anyone. The surrender came not with the roar of victory, but with the quiet disbelief of men too exhausted to celebrate. The war was over, and yet no one could quite feel it. In Dessau, the American soldiers who had fought their last battle were now the custodians of a fallen nation. Their rifles were still slung over their shoulders, but their duties had changed. They patrolled roads to keep looters away from food depots, guarded bridges that no longer led to battlefields, and tried to bring a fragile order to the chaos left behind. At night, the sound of distant artillery was replaced by crying, sometimes from children, sometimes from soldiers waking in terror. "You could feel the ghosts in every house," wrote Private Hanlon. "We'd walk into a room, and it felt like someone had just left, someone who wasn't coming back." Refugees poured in from the east, civilians fleeing the Red Army, German soldiers who had thrown away their weapons, and survivors from camps so emaciated that the Americans could hardly look them in the eyes. What the troops discovered in those first weeks after victory defied imagination. Outside Magdeburg, U.S. forces uncovered a concentration camp, its gates still smoldering. Inside were the remnants of humanity, bodies stacked like kindling, survivors too weak to stand, their hollow faces staring through the soldiers as if asking what took so long. Some GIs vomited, others wept openly. "It wasn't war anymore," said Corporal Weaver. "It was something darker. Something that made every fight we'd had feel small." The army ordered the townspeople to see what had been done in their name. They marched them through the camp, past the pits, the ovens, the piles of shoes and spectacles. Some denied it, some fainted, others simply broke down and fell to their knees. The Americans watched in silence, their expressions hard but empty. There was no satisfaction, only a grim need for truth to be seen. "We wanted the world to remember," said Sergeant McCloskey. "Because if they forgot, it could happen again." Days turned into weeks. The soldiers tried to find normalcy in the ruins. They cooked over open fires, wrote letters home, and traded chocolate for fresh eggs with the local farmers. Children began to emerge from hiding, shyly watching the Americans with wide eyes. Some GIs adopted stray dogs, others took to repairing bicycles for German kids. It was their way of reaching for something human again. Yet beneath the surface, the weight of what they had seen pressed on them like a second uniform. The laughter came easily but never lasted long. When word came of Hitler's suicide, few reacted. They were too far gone, too tired to hate a dead man. Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, passed quietly in many units. In Dessau, the men gathered in a square, where an officer read General Eisenhower's announcement aloud. There was no cheering, only a murmur of disbelief. Some shook hands, others walked away alone. We didn't feel like victors, Weaver recalled. We felt like witnesses. The occupation period began swiftly. Civilians were ordered to hand over weapons, Nazi officials were rounded up for interrogation. The soldiers found themselves policing people who, weeks earlier, had tried to kill them. It was an uneasy coexistence, resentful Germans, weary Americans, and the unspoken question of what came next. The locals tried to rebuild their shattered lives, while the GIs waited for word of redeployment or the long journey home. Rumors swirled, some would be sent to the Pacific, others might stay in Europe indefinitely. Then came the funerals. Rows of white crosses appeared on the edges of captured fields, marking the resting places of those who would never see home again. The soldiers attended in silence, helmets tucked under their arms, as chaplains read the same words they had heard too many times. For every man buried, another stood staring at the horizon, wondering why he had survived. We walked through the ashes, one wrote, and tried to find meaning. But meaning had burned away with everything else. The psychological wounds were slow to show but impossible to ignore. Nightmares haunted the barracks. Some men drank too much, others sat in silence for hours, staring at the ground. The army called it combat fatigue, but the men called it something simpler, the weight. It wasn't fear anymore, it was memory. Memory of fire, of faces, of sounds that never left their ears. As spring turned to summer, Germany began to green again. Grass grew between the cracks of bombed streets, and flowers sprouted near the ruins of churches. The Americans watched children play where tanks had burned only months before. For a moment, it felt like life was trying to return. Yet every sight of peace was shadowed by what they had seen, the evidence of madness, the cost of hate. Some soldiers took photographs, not for glory, but as proof. Proof that they had been there, that the things they saw were real. When orders finally came for redeployment, it was bittersweet. Many GIs packed their duffels in silence, leaving behind the graves of comrades and a country still haunted by its sins. As their convoys rolled out, the people of Dessau stood in the streets, some waving, others simply watching. One woman placed a bouquet of wildflowers on an American jeep. The soldier driving nodded, unable to speak. Back in the United States, parades awaited them, but the noise felt strange. The cheers, the flags, the brass bands, all of it seemed disconnected from the cold, broken silence of Germany. The soldiers smiled for their families, posed for photographs, but behind their eyes lay the same thousand-yard stare. They had seen too much to ever fully come home. In the aftermath of victory, the greatest struggle was not on the battlefield, it was within the men who survived it. They carried the voices of the fallen, the cries of the innocent, and the haunting stillness of a world that had destroyed itself. For some, those voices faded over time, for others, they never stopped whispering. The heart of Germany had been conquered, but the hearts of those who marched through it remained scarred forever. In the years that followed, when they spoke of the war, they rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of survival, of guilt, of mercy, and of what it meant to hold a rifle in one hand and humanity in the other. That was the true aftermath of 1945, not the end of conflict, but the beginning of remembrance. Years later, when the war was no longer a story of battles but of memory, the soldiers who had walked through the heart of Germany spoke of it in quiet voices. They didn't talk about strategy or medals or the grand sweep of victory, they talked about faces. The boy who surrendered with tears in his eyes, the woman who handed them bread from trembling hands, the comrades who never saw another sunrise. The war had not left them when they left the battlefield, it had settled inside them, an echo that time could not silence. In small towns across America, these men returned to ordinary lives, farmers, mechanics, teachers, fathers, but behind every calm gesture was the weight of what they had witnessed. Some could speak of it, most could not. The memories came in flashes: the smell of smoke, the sound of boots in rubble, the sight of the Elbe at dusk. For them, Germany was not a map or a headline, it was a place where they'd seen the limits of both cruelty and compassion. Historians would later call it liberation, victory, the fall of tyranny. But for those who were there, it was something more fragile and complex. It was standing in a ruined street and realizing that survival was not triumph, that justice did not erase grief, and that humanity, broken, weary, and flawed, had somehow endured. The soldiers of 1945 had carried their rifles into the abyss and emerged with the burden of remembering what it looked like. When asked, years later, what he felt when the war ended, Sergeant McCloskey said, "It never really did." His words captured what countless veterans could not explain, that peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of memory. Today, their voices still reach us through letters, photographs, and the fading ink of wartime journals. They remind us that history is not just about victory, but about the cost of it, the faces behind the statistics, the souls behind the uniforms. The heart of Germany, in 1945, was not only a place conquered by soldiers, it was a mirror in which humanity saw its own reflection, scarred and enduring. And in that reflection, we find the true legacy of the American GIs who marched through the ruins, not conquerors, not saviors, but witnesses to the moment when the world broke, and began, painfully, to rebuild.